everybody, we're picking back up with the nervous system and nerve impulse transmission. In your course pack, this information begins on page 96 and continues to page 97. Now, before watching this, I recommend that you watch my other video on nerve impulse transmission, but simply on resting potential. So hopefully you've already seen the video on resting potential. This video is going to talk about graded potential and how that may or may not lead to an action potential. The focus here for this video is depolarization, action potential, and repolarization. Let's review resting membrane potential. You may recall that sodium ions are housed outside of a cell's membrane, while potassiums are housed inside the cell's membrane. It is this uneven distribution of ions that promotes a polarized state, meaning that we have a positively charged exterior and a negatively charged cell interior. You may recall that at resting potential, negative 70 millivolts is what we see. That's how a cell maintains a resting state. So sodiums typically remain outside the cell, potassiums inside the cell during resting state. You may also recall that we've talked about the sodium-potassium pump as a way to maintain resting potential. It moves out 3 sodium ions while moving in 2 potassium ions. It is a pump, so it's powered with an energy molecule. Do you remember what that molecule is? Of course, that's ATP. And why do we move 3 sodiums out and only 2 potassiums back in? Well, it has to do with maintaining a polarized state, meaning more sodiums, or ions in general, are on the outside of the cell, while less are on the inside of the cell. If you had an even distribution, this overall charge here would be 0, and you would not have a polarized setup. You may recall that a polarized neuron relies on having our sodium-potassium channels closed. Because they are closed, for the most part, sodiums and potassiums are not going to be drifting in or out of the cell. So to maintain resting state, we have to rely on those sodium and potassium channels staying closed. We know that chemically gated sodium channels will open when acetylcholine binds. So thinking back, you may recall that acetylcholine is a neurotransmitter. When it binds to a sodium channel, those sodium channels will open. So it's just like putting a key in a lock. As soon as you turn that key into the lock, that door can open. So same concept here. When acetylcholine binds to a sodium channel, that sodium channel opens and sodium can rush into the cell. Because acetylcholine holds the key, we say that these are chemically gated channels. So when acetylcholine causes them to open, those protein channels now allow sodium to rush into the cell. So here you can see sodium channels open and sodium coming into the cell. Currently, this potassium channel is still closed, so potassium has not yet had the opportunity to leak out. We know that resting state is negative 70 millivolts. When you open up a sodium channel, you start changing the polarized state. In fact, the interior becomes a little more positive and a little more positive the more that sodium comes leaking into the interior of the cell. So anytime you change the polarization by allowing sodium to rush in, we say that that cell is depolarizing. Now, depolarization means that you move from a negative 70 state, which is our resting state, to negative 65, to negative 60, and you can keep on going. So when you're doing this, when you're making the interior become more positive or less negative, we say that you are depolarizing the cell. It is only when you reach a critical value, negative 55 millivolts, that you've reached something that we call threshold. So that's why I say here that depolarization can lead to an action potential. It can if you reach that threshold value of negative 55. If you only depolarize to say negative 65 or negative 60, you have not reached threshold, so action potential is not a guarantee. So if you start to reach threshold, which is negative 55 millivolts, good number to know, then other neighboring protein channels will begin to open. Notice, there is not a place for acetylcholine to bind here, and we're not talking about it because that's not part of the conversation. Instead, these neighboring sodium channels are so excited because there is a rush of sodiums coming into this cell that they open too. So it's like one set of doors open, another set of doors open, and then just like a domino effect or a chain reaction, more and more sodium channels open due to the excitement of having sodiums rush into the cells. So this voltage gated type of channel here opens when we hit threshold and we're reaching this depolarized state with positive charges inside the cell, and we're moving more and more positive. So we become -30, we become 0, we even move into positive territory for millivolt charge. So this here, what you're looking at, occurs at action potential. We have reached threshold. Depolarization guarantees that we're going to perform an action potential. This is called the all or none principle, meaning once you reach threshold, there is no turning back. This is going to go for it. We are heading for action potential no matter what. And so there's no way to turn around or reverse at this point. It is all or none. So let's talk about this term here, graded potential. Graded potential can occur if you have an area of localized depolarization. Maybe you have some sodiums enter into a cell and the polarization changes to about -60. That is simply a case of a graded potential. If your cell does not reach threshold, -55 millivolts, then we're not going to be able to have an action potential. We simply say it's a localized area of graded potential. Graded potential does not follow the all or none principle because we didn't reach threshold. You've got to reach threshold in order to have an action potential. Now, by contrast, an action potential travels the length of the cell as a nerve impulse. This occurs because the cell does reach threshold at -55, which guarantees that we're going to follow the all or none principle. So let me give you a couple of examples to explain how this works. If you've ever been to a football game in a stadium, somebody may decide that they want to do the wave. If they raise their arms and some friends around them, they also raise their arms, maybe this doesn't catch on. Maybe people look over and say, I'm not really interested in participating. That is simply a case of graded potential. You didn't reach threshold if only a few people throw their arms in the air. Now, if everybody is in on it and everybody says, hey, that looks like fun, and they throw their arms in the air, and the next thing you know, you have the wave circulating around the football stadium, you've now created threshold. You've hit that number needed in order for an action potential to generate, and we now have the all or none principle that's been met. Everybody's doing the wave. So in order to create an action potential, you have to hit threshold. If you don't hit -55 millivolts, then all you have is a graded potential. Let me give you another way to think about this. If you have some acetylcholine, open up a few sodium channels, and some sodium rushes into the cell. The cell may not reach threshold. What do you have? You have graded potential because you didn't reach threshold. Okay? If you had enough sodium rush in that we hit that critical value of threshold, boom, you've got action potential. So another way to think about this is sitting at a stoplight. If somebody's revving their engine and trying to race at the stoplight, if your car stalls, graded potential, right? You went nowhere. But if you are able to make your car go when you fly off from that stoplight, action potential, you hit it. So graded potentials are exactly as their name implies. They diminish with distance. They do not have the ability to carry over to threshold or to reach the all or none principle. So an action potential is not guaranteed. Let's talk about this. We haven't yet discussed hyperpolarization, so let's focus instead on resting potential at -70. If you have some sodiums come into a cell, you can move from -70 to -60. That may be simply a case of a graded potential. Depolarization does not guarantee action potential. What number must you meet in order to guarantee an action potential? -55, right? That is our critical number in order for us to reach threshold. And at that point, the all or none principle is met. That means you're either going to have an action potential or you're not. If you reach -55, all is met. If you don't reach -55, then none. So there is nothing halfway about a nerve impulse. You either have one or you don't. At -55, those voltage-gated sodium channels open, more sodiums rush in, depolarization continues, and we eventually reach the height of action potential, which may be as high as 30 to 40 millivolts. So that way, we tend to see the maximum number of sodiums coming into the cell to conduct that nerve impulse. Now we'll hit hyperpolarization in just a moment. I want to show you this. Here is -70. What's that number mean to us? Well, that means resting potential. That means a polarized setup with mostly sodiums outside the cell and potassiums inside. At -55, we reach threshold, meaning what? That means you have enough sodiums rushing in to cause your cell to depolarize, reach threshold, and continue opening up more voltage-gated sodium channels. That means more and more sodiums rush in, and eventually you can reach this peak of action potential at around positive 40 millivolts. Eventually, the stimulus has no more effect, and so you'll see under this falling phase here, we fall back not just to resting potential, but we fall below resting potential. Under this line here is what we call hyperpolarization. So sometimes we see the cell hyperpolarize before it can go back to its -70 resting state. So hyperpolarization means that we have an environment that's more negative than -70, and that makes it difficult for this cell to reach action potential once again. So it's the cell's ability to restore back to the resting state that determines when it can perform another action potential. So let's talk about what it means to return a cell to its resting state. So at the height of action potential, we had a bunch of sodiums inside the cell, okay? Our charge was positive in here, right? Okay, so once we start to finish this action potential, these sodium channels here, they're going to close, okay? And these potassium channels, they're slow, but they're going to open. And they're going to allow for these potassiums here to begin to exit. So potassium is going to leave to the outside. Wait a minute. Where's potassium supposed to be? At resting state, it's supposed to be inside. So why does it leave? Well, it leaves to restore the positive charge on the outside of your cell and the negative charge here on the inside of your cell. So by leaving, it helps us to restore the -70 millivolt charge. Or you may even hyperpolarize, which means lots of potassiums leave. You can go -90, go -110. All of these are more negative than our resting state. So let's repeat this. When you're experiencing action potential, you have all these sodiums inside your cell. Eventually, the sodium channels close. The sodiums are stuck on the inside of the cell. These potassium channels are slow to open, but when they do, these potassiums exit to the exterior of the cell. Why do they do this? It is to restore resting potential. Okay, that's what repolarization means. It means restoring that resting potential. So yeah, this leaves your ions in the wrong location, but we have a solution for this. All right, so of course, if you have too many potassiums exit out, you will go further than -70, maybe -90, maybe a -110. And what this means is you're too far from threshold, which is -55, right, in order to reach threshold once again, or action potential. So hyperpolarization means that this cell is unable to perform another action potential. Not quite yet. So here's our solution. Because your potassiums leaked out of the cell, and because your sodiums are still stuck inside the cell, here comes our sodium-potassium pump to the rescue. It pumps out 3 sodiums to the exterior and returns 2 potassiums back inside. Now, keep in mind, we're not doing a 3-for-3 exchange. It's a 3-for-2 exchange because we're looking to polarize this membrane, meaning we want the interior to have a negative charge, and we want the outside to have a positive charge. Ultimately, we want to restore this back to a -70 millivolt. Now, as long as this sodium-potassium pump is operating, we're not going to be able to conduct another nerve impulse. This has to complete its task during repolarization. So, this time period where our sodium-potassium pump is restoring these ions back to their normal locations, we are in what's called a refractory period. That term is on the bottom of page 97. The refractory period is the amount of time that must pass before an action potential can be generated again. So your speed of returning another action potential depends on the speed of your sodium-potassium pump. So let's review. Graded potentials can turn into action potentials. They are, however, not a guarantee. If you meet threshold, which is negative 55 millivolts, what does that graded potential happen to do? Well, the graded potential here at negative 55 turns into an action potential. So right here, at that point of negative 55, is where we meet the all or none principle. So either you meet 55 and become an action potential, which is the all portion, or nothing happens. The cell restores its resting state and nothing goes on about its way. So that's what we're looking at here, is graded versus action. We had just discussed hyperpolarization, which means that when a cell restores its resting state, it may in fact become more negative than when it does at resting potential. That's because potassiums are leaking out and exiting through those open potassium channels. So this picture reviews for us the steps of action potential. So let's label the parts of this. Here, right through there, is resting potential. How do I know that? Well, I have negative charges inside and positive charges outside. I would assume at resting state I'm at negative 70 millivolts. Right behind it, however, this region here, I notice that something's coming into the cell and the interior now changes positive. What must be rushing in this next picture? That must be sodium's rushing in through open sodium channels. Okay, so in this image here, you'll notice that we have resting potential, which I'm going to abbreviate as RP for here. How do you know that? Because you have a negative charge inside, positive charge outside. Here in the middle, we have an action potential. How do I know that? These are sodiums, and they're rushing in to the cell, creating a positive charge on the inside, and because there's less of them outside, leaves us a negative charge there. Finally, here we have a return to resting potential. So we call this region here repolarization. And we see that we have charges exiting out. Now, be careful here. What is actually leaving the cell? Those are potassiums that are leaking out. The sodiums are going to be restored to their exterior environment when we have the sodium-potassium pump involved. So notice here the action potential is moving in this direction, so it'll eventually move here past that resting state. All right, and so finally you see a case here of resting potential. Here you see repolarization, and here you see action potential. So all of this conversation has been about an unmyelinated axon. Had our conversation been this one here for saltatory conduction, it would have been a very quick and easy conversation. Now you tell me, right? So when we talk about myelinated axons, nerve impulses only need to hop, skip, and jump from one node of rendezvous to the next. So what that means is the nerve impulse can travel like rapid fire down the length of a myelinated axon present in white matter. So here, at this node of rendezvous, is the only place that we tend to see depolarization occurring.